About astronomy or writing or research. Yeah.
What's your methodology in researching a book like this? I mean, do you do it on your own? Do you have staff? I ask only because I have been curious about that, these type of works, and I've often wondered what an amazing amount of prep it must take.
I'd love to have a staff if somebody wants to volunteer.
Could you give me an insight of how you tackled it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this book actually, there's a number of different strands of research that went into it. The astronomy, of course, is one large part. Another large section is, of course, the novel is set in Ireland in the late 1700s and the rebellion of 1798, which is largely overlooked by much of 19th century, but was really one of the first rebellions that launched Ireland's long, slow journey toward independence in the 20th century. Also plays a large part in this. So this was really drawing upon a number of different strands of interest that I had. And when this book first began, I wasn't thinking in quite so focused a way about astronomy itself as being the sort of focus of the whole story. But to just give you some insight into how that worked, I was actually working on an earlier version of this manuscript several years ago, and I went to the Harry Ransom Center to see a show on Edgar Allan Poe because they have Poe's desk, of course. And when I went to that show, there was another exhibit going on in a smaller room next door that were some astronomical drawings and some telescopes and some globes. And there was a big painting on the wall of the moon, and the card at the bottom said that this was done by Carolyn Herschel, and it was part of the Herschel family papers in the Ransom Center. So I found out that there was a whole collection of William Herschel's papers at the Ransom Center and spent a summer there researching that. And what I found were notebooks and manuscripts and little cards with notations, and it really created a real sense of the frenetic activity of what it must have been like at that time to be really the first people to be discovering new objects in the sky. And so that's really where the kind of urgency of the astronomical story came from. Since you can find facts and details pretty much anywhere, but that kind of archival material where you get a real sense of who the people were doing the discoveries is really what I think brings the research alive for me. And if I had a staff doing that, I wouldn't have that same,
well, I had to ask.
Yeah, no, I mean,
we know people who do.
Yes, right.
Yeah, good, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I noticed in the chapter that you read that there's a lot of kind of musical analogy and everything. Does that run throughout the book? Is that something that you're conscious of? Does it become more foregranted or something later, or is it just something that kind of is always there?
It is always there. It's actually, I should have said this before I read the chapter. William Herschel was actually a musician. And so not only was his discovery of Uranus accidental, his becoming an astronomer was, in a way, accidental. He began his life as a musician. He was an oboist in the Prussian army. And right after France and Prussia went to war, his father insisted that he should flee the army and go to England so that he didn't die in senseless battles. So William found himself in Bath, England in the mid-1700s, trained as a musician. He became the principal organist at the Octagon Chapel in Bath. He wrote 24 symphonies, a number of oratorios. He gave music lessons. This was how he supported himself. And of course, Bath was a tourist resort. And so from people who were coming to visit, he began to get interested in this sort of new science of astronomy. He grew interested, because of his interest in music, he grew interested in mathematics, and mathematics led him to optics, and optics led him to astronomy. And he was dissatisfied with the quality of telescopes in the period, so he decided he would just make his own. And so he taught himself how to make telescopes. And so he was entirely a self-taught astronomer and telescope maker, but his real background was music. And when his sister Carolyn comes to live with him, he trains her how to be a singer and a musician, and together they give music lessons in their home up until the moment when he discovers Uranus. And then he becomes so famous, he sort of gives up giving music lessons and just begins to be an astronomer full-time. But that's where the musical imagery comes from. He was actually at this time supporting himself as a music teacher.
Okay, so that was the way they were both thinking.
Yes, right, exactly, yeah.
Have you ever seen Uranus through a telescope?
I have, yes. Yeah, it's and it's even now it's amazing now to think for not very much money at all, we can buy equipment that auto tracks the sky, and you can just very quickly coordinate it and plug it in and punch in some numbers, and these things sort of move all on their own and zero in, and will just track an object across the sky. They were doing all of this by hand. I mean, the mirror that I'm referring to is, I don't know if you're familiar with reflecting telescopes, but in an achromatic telescope, you have two glass lenses, and that's sort of what a ship captain uses, a telescope that you look this way. A reflecting telescope is a dish, basically, that's a mirror that's curved so that it collects light and magnifies it and focuses it. And this is what William Herschel made. And so he would actually do away with the secondary lens, and he basically just had a big tube with a polished piece of tin at the bottom, and he's looking over the tube at this tin, and that's what he's using to discover planets. It's really amazing how much they were able to accomplish with some very crude instruments at the time.
Yeah, so I was intrigued by this comparison of the musical instruments to the astronomical instruments, maybe.
Yeah.
Is there more truth to that astronomy relied on musical instrument techniques to start building the equipment that they needed to explore the skies?
No, I don't know that necessarily the construction of musical instruments was a skill that then led to the construction of telescopes, but mathematics played a huge role. I mean, it continues to play a huge role in astronomy, and it was sort of the main reason why I didn't become an astronomer. Once I found out it took math, seeing Uranus through a telescope was great, but sort of calculating its orbit, I wasn't capable of that. But no, the connections, between other disciplines in astronomy, I think were much more apparent at this period than they are now. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating about this period in history is this is really the last moment before the arts and sciences sort of become divorced in the way that we treat them now. And so to be there were no full-time astronomers, really. I mean, to be an astronomer meant that you were either very wealthy and you could afford to buy telescopes and could pursue it as a hobby, or you were someone like William Herschel who had a job as a musician to support yourself, and you were building your own telescopes and were pursuing it as a hobby. But even as an astronomer, if you were going to be an astronomer, there's no photography, so you have to be an artist because you have to be able to draw pictures of what you're seeing, or otherwise there's no way to capture that. And you have to be a mathematician to be able to do longhand all the calculations that are going to determine what it is you've actually discovered. So the musical instruments themselves weren't necessarily more closely aligned with astronomical instruments, but the disciplines themselves of music and mathematics and art were definitely more closely intertwined with astronomy and the sciences than we tend to think of them right now.
Having studied the historical characters, how were you able to fictionalize them and make them your own characters? And do you see a difference between the two sets?
Yeah, well, sorry. What I usually try to do in dealing with a historical figure as a fictional character is to try to find what might be a root emotional core to that character that doesn't come through, say, in a historical text. So there are plenty of wonderful books and biographies out there about William Herschel, and no one needs me to write another story about Herschel telling us exactly what he did, because that information is all out there. So what I usually try to do with these historical characters is to figure out what might have been, to my mind, a driving emotional impulse in them. And one of the curious things about William Herschel is that he was a deserter from the army. And so when he came to England, he left his family behind in Hanover, Germany. He had to learn English. He had to make a new life for himself. And there was always this sense that he had that he felt guilty, that he could go home, but also he was known as a deserter back in his country. And at the same time, this is the reign of George III, this is the Hanoverian king on the throne of England. So William Herschel's countryman is on the throne of England. And when he discovers Uranus, he doesn't call it Uranus. And in fact, the planet is never called Uranus in his lifetime. He names it Georgium Sidus, George's star. He names it after the king, and in return, the king grants him a pardon for having deserted the army decades earlier. So with that in mind, I tried to draw some connections to see him not just as a musician or an astronomer who's driven by discovery, but someone who's sort of plagued by a sense of guilt or remorse, or is looking for some kind of redemption in his life for having deserted the army. And that becomes sort of one of the driving emotional forces in making him a fictional character as opposed to just a historic figure. It's not until after he dies that they decide to rename it Uranus, because the French just wouldn't put up with calling a planet after a British king. They refused to call it Georgium Sidus. So. Thank you.